I would like to analyze inequality in the context of globalization. Globalization is a phenomenon which has been going on since there are human beings on this planet. But at some points in the history, globalization is accelerating. And I don't think that there will be any doubt of the fact that we are in such a period during which we have an acceleration of the process of globalization. This has been going on for the last 2 or 3 decades, and it is most likely that this will be going on still for some decades. It is very difficult to imagine that such a change in the way in which our societies function, relate to each other, would not have an impact on the way in which people within the societies are functioning. That this would not have an impact on the differences among people. And what I'm interested in is really, in the context of globalization, what is going on with inequality. And this is the presentation that I will give today. So this presentation is based on a book which I published a few months ago. It was in September in French. Then I'm doing some advertising. If you read French, please buy the book. Okay, good. And the book will be, so if you don't read French, you can wait a little. And an expanded version will be published in English in September. And it will also that it will also be published in Italian. And if there are some German speakers among you, then it will also be in German. So normally everybody should have a chance to access that book. The point of that book is the book deals with issues which are difficult issues, technically difficult issues. I will not spend very much time on those technical issues today, the relationship between inequality and various aspects of the way in which an economy works. The idea in the book was going to try to analyze, discuss the issues in front of us, possibly to discuss some policy decisions in front of us, more than insisting on the technical aspect. And I will do the same thing today. I will not really get into the technicalities of economic models which try to relate inequality with other things. Okay, so let me go on. With this citation, I must say that I wanted to start this lecture, of course, by a citation by Max Weber, and I could not find a very convincing one. Why? Simply because I realized that the way in which Max Weber talked about inequality is not using that often the word inequality. It was much more in the sense of social classes, and you have this usual opposition between social classes as seen by Marx and social classes as seen by Weber. But the way in which he defines those classes is very, very different from the way in which we define inequality and from the whole objective of inequality analysis. So instead of citing Weber, I'm citing here Raymond Aron, who is a French philosopher, a political scientist, who, as a matter of fact, was a great fan of Max Weber and was the one who really introduced Max Weber to the French public. So I'm citing Max Weber through Raymond Aron. And I must say I like very much this sentence which says the following: in the human society, in the process of unification, and this is the way in which you can define globalization, inequality between nations acquires the same meaning as inequality among classes. This is the link with Max Weber. In the past, standards of living differ today between continents or between countries more than they ever did. At the same time, the perception of inequality increases, whereas resignation to poverty and to destiny is disappearing. And I interpret this second part of the citation as saying that people are more and more sensitive to inequality. But not necessarily to inequality in the world, certainly to inequality around them, that is, inequality in their own country. And my whole presentation will be based on this kind of dualism between inequality at the global level and inequality at the national level. So I think it was a nice way to start the presentation. The second citation I could not resist because I was citing Raymond Aron, not to cite Henry Aron, who is famous to have said that economists or social scientists working on inequality are basically useless because, as he said, studying income inequality is like watching the grass grow. So nothing is happening. You will spend years looking at a piece of grass increased by 1 millimeter. So it is not really an object for research by social scientists. What is quite interesting is that we are in a situation where presently at a time where this is exactly the opposite. Grass is growing very, very quickly, so quickly that we are ready to cut it. And I think it's also interesting to see that things have changed and in a very unexpected way. And so that those two citations give a good idea about what I'm up to. The basic questions are the following. I'm starting from a fact. The fact is that there is a double reversal in the evolution of world inequality today. On the one hand, global inequality is declining after centuries of increase. And the second reversal is that national inequalities are increasing after not centuries, but certainly after decades, during which they were extremely stable. And I'm trying to understand why we have this kind of opposite evolution of those two dimensions of world inequality. And of course, the question is to know whether there is a common cause to those evolutions, which is globalization. We know that globalization has something to do with the evolution of the global income distribution, and we know, simply by reading newspapers every day, about companies closing down factories, etc. We know that globalization has also something to do with national inequalities. And the point is, are we able to articulate in a rigorous way the link between globalization and those two aspects of the change in world inequality? And if we're able to do that, then there are two questions we may ask. First, should we be concerned by the increase in national inequality? And in particular, isn't it the case that there is a danger, there is a threat, that with too much national inequality, with national inequality increasing too rapidly, then there will be a stop put on the process of globalization. There will be possibly a reversal in globalization, and at the same time there will be a loss of all the gains that the global community can get from globalization. And if this is the case, then of course we need to intervene, we need to think of policies which will allow us to take advantage of the globalization process, make sure that global inequality continues to decrease, but trying to prevent national inequalities to grow. So these are the issues that I would like to look at in the remaining 40 and something minutes. Of course, you can understand that I will certainly not have time to go in much detail, but I would like simply to convey general ideas on these various topics. So let's start with the facts. What Georgia has already shown, and I can go very quickly on this. First, what happened to inequality in the world? If we look at global inequality, and if we define global inequality essentially as inequality among world citizens, that is combining the disparities in income or in the standards of living of people living in Australia, and people living in Rwanda, and people living in Laos. We put all those people together, and we look at the disparities among all of them. Not between countries, but between all of them. And in order to measure the standard of living, we can, because there are difficulties with data sources, one very simple way of doing things, simply to rely on the most often used statistic, which is GDP per capita for all the countries in the world, and take that as the norm, the mean of the standard of living in one country, and then in order to get all the disparities within that country, to apply to that mean the distribution of income that is being observed in standard household surveys. So we have sample of households, and we can indeed take into account the differences across individual people. So this is the way in which this works. The household surveys in general, this is not always the case, refer to disposable income per consumption unit. This notion of disposable income after taxes and after transfers is something important, and you'll see why in just a moment. So this is the kind of trick or the kind of arithmetic that we can play in order to generate something that would resemble a global distribution where we would take into account all the world citizens. And then what we get is the following. When we do something of this type on the historical period, something I've done some time ago with my colleague FranEØS, we've done something of this type, of course, with a lot of approximation. You cannot work in the 19th century with the same kind of data that you have in the 21st century. Household surveys were very, very scarce back in 1820. So we have to rely on some approximation, but in this paper that we wrote, we were able to show that measurement errors were certainly of an order of magnitude much less important than the change that was observed in the evolution of inequality in the world. Those two curves in this graph show the top one is the evolution of the Gini coefficient, which is standard measure of income inequality, which goes from 0 to 1. And the bottom curve corresponds to the ratio of the mean income of the 20% the richest in the world and the 20% the poorest in the world. So remember that the 20% richest in the world would include American people, emirs living in the Gulf, but also would include some Brazilians, would include possibly some Ethiopians who are very rich. So all those people are combined there. What you observe here is that in the history we have this very steady increase of inequality. We start at the time of the Industrial Revolution. A couple of countries start to grow much faster than the others. They are followed by more countries, and over time we have this big divide of the world between finally developed and developing countries, and those curves is really simply the history of that evolution. And what is really noticeable here is that back in the early 19th century, the Gini coefficient is 0.500, which is high, but we observe today several countries with this kind of degree of inequality. By the early 90s, the Gini coefficient is around 0.66, and this is already something very, very big, and there are very few countries in the world with this kind of inequality. But this is not what I want to insist upon. What I want to insist upon is precisely the chart that Georgia has shown before, which is this one, which is comparing the recent evolution of world inequality, defined as I did before, in the historical perspective. So the right-hand part of those curves is obtained with much more recent data, and because we don't need all the approximation that was needed in the historical period, so it's a discontinuity in the 90s, because one method is not leading to the same inequality than the other. There are two reasons for that. The first reason is that in the recent past we were able to work with 160 countries. And in the historical period, we were working not with 160, but with groups of countries, because back in the 19th century, there was no country called Rwanda, there was no country called Laos, and because of that, we had to work with a group of countries, and this explains why suddenly, by having more countries, we have more inequality. But this is not the most important reason. In order to compare the standard of living across countries, we cannot use standard exchange rate. We cannot say we will convert the Indian rupees into dollars using the exchange rate, and we will compare the dollar figure to the Mexican mean income, converting the pesos in dollars using the exchange rate. Why? Simply because prices are not the same. And we want to take into account differences in purchasing power parity. In order to do that, we need to collect data on prices everywhere in the world. For a very long time, the purchasing power parity indicator that existed were based on a survey of this type done in 1990. And recently, the same project was undertaken on a much bigger scale in 2005. And then when we started to use or to compute the purchasing power parity indicators with the 2005 database, we discovered that we were really very far off the mark in several countries. In particular, we discovered that China was not as rich as we believed. And because you have 1 billion people behind that, reducing the income, the standard of living of 1 million people in the world, because we have changed the purchasing power parity. Of course, this has an impact, an important impact on inequality, and this is what explains the discontinuity toward the upward discontinuity that you see in those curves. But what is important is that after centuries of increase, maybe some stability at the end of the period, you see that now we have a very clear reduction, very clear decrease in the degree of global inequality in the world. And this is really big, this is really very important. If you look at the blue curve, in 20 years, from 89 to 2006, I am in the process of updating those data, but this stops in 2006, the Gini coefficient went down by 5 percentage points. It took 70 years, more or less, to increase by 5 percentage points in the past. So this means that in 20 years, it was possible to erase the inequality which had been accumulated during 70 years before. So this is really a process which is present and which is very, very strong. So this is the first point. And as an illustration of that, I think it is something important, you have the evolution of poverty in the world, which is somewhat connected to inequality, which is the number of people or the proportion of people below $1.25 a day. And we see here that the blue curve is the proportion of people below that limit, that threshold. The top curve is the number of people. Another thing we can see here is the fact that for quite some time, the proportion of poor people was going down, but the number of people was more or less constant. In other words, the economic progress was just able to offset the impact on poverty of demographic growth. And over the recent past, you can see that this is not anymore the case. Economic progress is stronger than demographic growth, and then the number of poor people in the world is going down. This is very much related to this reversal of global inequality. Now let's look at what is going on within countries. And on this chart, we still have Gini coefficients defined on disposable income per consumption unit, so it's a nice definition of the standard of living. And we have simply on this chart the change in the Gini coefficient between the mid-80s and the mid-2000s. Again, I'm trying to update this chart these days, and this would not change what is observed here. And here we have OECD countries which are not transition countries, which are not caught in this transition from a socialist economy to a market economy in around at the beginning of the 90s. And what you can observe here is that you have more or less two-thirds, until more than two-thirds of those countries where inequality is increasing. And as Georgia said a little before, in some cases it is increasing big time. Finland is a case like that. Then you have Portugal, New Zealand. So it is somewhat surprising to see that in countries which are quite stable in economic terms, which for years had unchanged Gini coefficient, over the last 20 years, something is moving, and moving really, really fast. Now, not every country is in that situation, but there is a majority of countries in that case. Georgia was mentioning that France was an exception. It was an exception. I'm afraid that it will not be an exception anymore with the next set of data. If you look at France between the mid-90s and the end of the 2000s, then there is an increase in inequality. So we could maybe say that France is an exception in the sense that they are the latecomers in that class. But then you have the other chart that Georgia has shown, which is this one, which is the evolution of the share of the top 5% in total income on the historical period. These are the data coming from the database Top Income, which have been put together by Thomas Piketty and Tony Atkinson in particular, with many different colleagues. This is taken from tax data, but this is market income. And this is important to make the distinction. Market income is income before any kind of redistribution. So you look at income before taxes in particular. If you were to look at income after taxes, you would have something not different in terms of the big changes, but the amplitude of the changes would not be that big. And what you observe on this chart is this U-shape, where inequality starts at a very high level at the beginning of the 20th century. Then you have this big drop in inequality taking place more or less at the time of the Second World War and after. So you have possibly the destruction of property during the Second World War. You have the increase in the taxation is not there, so I was about to say something wrong. And after the war, you have the building of the welfare state. You have an economy which is stabilizing a different regime, and you have a very long period of stability. And then around the 80s, early 80s, mid-80s, you have the curve which is going up again. The top curve, which is for the US, you can see that in the US in the beginning of 2000, the level of inequality of market income measured by that is equivalent to what it was 1 century ago. So in 1 century, inequality in the US went down quite substantially and then went up again, and we have no change. But it is not a US phenomenon. UK is in the same situation. If you can read on the screen, Japan is the third one coming from the top, which is again increasing. France is there. The slope is much smaller than the other countries, but there is an increase. And what is quite interesting is to see Sweden, which is at the bottom. So Sweden is more egalitarian in terms of market income than the others. But you have the same phenomenon, which is the fact that inequality, as measured by that, is increasing in Sweden, despite this egalitarian culture that you can observe in Sweden. A related element, which I believe is very important to understand what is going on, is an aggregate, is a macroeconomic concept instead of a microeconomic concept where you look at individuals. Here we look at the evolution of the labor share in developed countries. again over a long period since 1985, this is our OECD data. And what you observe is among the big OECD countries, among some members of the G7, Italy, France, Germany, UK, US, and Japan, in more or less all of them, you have a kind of long-run trend toward less and less of the GDP going to labor, so implicitly more and more going to capital. And as we know that the capital is much less equitably distributed than labor, of course this contributes necessarily to the increase in inequality. So this curve is really certainly to be related to the previous curve and has something to do with the increase in the share of the top, the richest people in those countries over the recent past. So capital and the capital labor distribution certainly plays an important role. This is for the developed countries. For developing countries, the same kind of figure, this is all countries except Latin. We see that in many countries we have a big increase in inequality. You cannot read the name of the country. At the top you have China. As well, it is China rural, because in China there is a difficulty in comparing the rural sector and the urban sector because the purchasing power parity to use is not completely clear. But you have China, you have India, you have some African countries, you have many, as a matter of fact, Asian countries are there. Indonesia is there, Vietnam is there, the Philippines is there. So this very dynamic part of the world is definitely a part of the world where inequality tends to increase. So we cannot say that it is as general as in developed countries, but there is something of this type. Here you have Latin America. Latin America is interesting because historically Latin America is the most inegalitarian continent. In Latin America, the Gini coefficient is more or less systematically above 0.5. It is more on the 0.52, 53. Brazil was 20 years ago at 0.60. And you see that in Latin America, over the last 20 years, you have countries where inequality is increasing despite the fact that it is initially really high, and you have countries where inequality is decreasing, and I will come back to that right at the end of the presentation to understand, to say, to show that, of course, something is possible from a policy point of view. There is no iron law saying that inequality should increase. And it is the same chart as we have seen before. The US is still at the middle because this is the only continuous curve that we have. But you have Argentina, you have China, which was already shown by Georgia, you have India, you have Indonesia, and in all cases you observe that you have the same increase in the recent past, except for Indonesia. But for a couple of months, I'm asking my colleagues to tell me, to explain to me what is going on in Indonesia, and I didn't get the answer yet. I am the director of that school, but my power is limited to some aspects of the school. Okay, now, these are the facts. Now let's get into what is behind that. What can explain this evolution of inequality at the global level or inequality at the national level? And let's try to see what role globalization can play in this. First, if we look at global inequality, it is not difficult to imagine that the reason why global inequality is going down is because we have this process of catching up of emerging countries with respect to developed countries. What is behind that, of course, is the fact that China, India, many other countries, big countries in Asia, have grown very, very fast over the last 2 decades or 3 decades. And of course, this has an impact on the global distribution. So the evolution of global distribution is driven by the change in the between-country inequality. Now, is this catching up process the result of globalization? Some people would probably say, yes, definitely this is the only explanation for that. I don't think I completely agree with that. I would say that globalization is part of this, but it is not the only thing. When China, in the end of the 70s, early 80s, decided to liberalize partially the market of rice in the rural side, this generates immediately an increase in productivity, which was enormous. Suddenly people had an incentive to produce more because they were able to get the money corresponding to that, instead of having to produce the quota that was required by the planning office. Now, only because of that, there has been, in those days in China, and this was before the opening up of China to foreign trade, there was an increase, a growth rate which accelerated, and this immediately produced a drop in the growth inequality in the world. So, to say that what is behind this evolution of the distribution of income across countries is essentially globalization is probably not completely true, but yes, it is true that at some stage China and other Asian countries could benefit from foreign investments, companies coming to settle in those countries, to be able to re-export manufactured goods from those countries. And this definitely had a big impact on the growth of those economies, on employment, on productivity. Those foreign investors were bringing new technology, were bringing markets. Without that, China would not have been able to penetrate foreign markets. So it is undoubtedly the case that the globalization or the opening up of China contributed to its growth. And it is the same thing, again, to a lesser extent in India, certainly the same thing in Vietnam and in many other countries. So part of the explanation is globalization. Another part which is also quite interesting is that over the more recent past, the last 15 years, we observe an acceleration of growth in Latin America, and more importantly in Africa, at a time where many people were essentially desperate about Africa, saying that it was the lost continent and nothing would be possible, and suddenly growth rates accelerated. Now, there are two schools to explain that. One is to say, after all what we told those people, they understood that they must have a good governance in order to develop. They made governance progress, and we see the result of those progress. One school. The other school says, we don't believe that. What we observe is that commodity prices have been since the beginning of the 2000s at a level which we have not seen for the last 50 years, and those countries simply are benefiting from very high commodity prices, and they're spending the money in new construction, new infrastructure. This is feeding the domestic economy, and the GDP is going up because of that. Now, if this is the case, then truly the development here is due to globalization. Is driven by the fact that trade has increased, or the demand for the goods produced by those countries has increased. Now, what school is right? Probably one school is right in a few countries. Another would say that the second school is right in many more countries. But this is a way to say that globalization is real. Within countries, it is to some extent more interesting. If we start with developed countries, the very standard explanation of the increase in inequality in the US, which generated a number of papers, says, what we observe is very simple. We open up trade with Asia. The comparative advantage of Asia is unskilled labor, and therefore Asia will export to the US goods which are intensive in unskilled labor, and those sectors in the US will decline. And then unskilled labor will be hurt by that, and if you were to push the standard theorem of the pure theory of trade, the famous Egg-Sherolli-Samuelson theorem, you would end up saying that the wages of unskilled workers in the US should be at the same level as wages of unskilled workers in China. And there was this very famous paper by Chris Freeman in the Journal of Economic Perspective in the 80s, late 80s, the title of which was Are Your Wages Set in Beijing? Of course, he was talking to Americans. And this was really the view. And probably there is something of this type. Probably when we observe the evolution of the distribution of income in the US in those days, we see that indeed the bottom is losing with respect to the rest of the distribution. But when we look now at the more recent evolution with the increase in inequality, we observe that the bottom didn't recover completely, but is more or less back to where it was in the end of the 70s. But inequality is due to what is going on at the very top. So it's not anymore a story of unskilled workers are affected by the expansion of trade with emerging countries. The story must be something different. Now, what are the explanations which are given to that? The first explanation is to say the competition with emerging countries in terms of type of labor has evolved. Now today, many companies in Europe, in the US, are outsourcing some of their service activity in emerging countries. Accounting, back office operations of financial institutions, writing computer code, call centers, of course. All this is more and more being concentrated in emerging countries. Now this time you have a competition between workers in Asia or in Latin America or in North Africa, depending on the language that is being spoken, and not anymore unskilled workers, but with white collars, people who have some level of education, and therefore the competition may have moved up, and instead of having only the bottom of the distribution losing, maybe the bottom and the middle. But to say that the bottom and the middle are losing is the same thing as saying that the top is gaining. So there is this view, there is this study by a couple of British economists, labor economists about this, where their view is to say we tend to see a kind of disappearance of the middle of the distribution of wages, and this would correspond to this kind of evolution. Another explanation which is given, and this would correspond to what some people call the new theory of trade, or there are always new theories somewhere in economics. We have already seen the new theory of trade, which was introducing imperfect competition. So I think this one might be called the new theory of trade, which insists on the fact that firms are heterogeneous. And when you look at differences between exporting firms and non-exporting firms, you find that, not surprisingly, exporting firms are more productive and pay higher wages than non-exporting firms. Why? More productive because they are exposed to competition which is much stronger on foreign markets. And because of that, they have to hire people or to train people in a better way, so wages are higher. And if trade is expanding, and if there are more companies exporting, this means that we'll have a kind of dichotomy, kind of dualism within any economy where part of the labor force will be paid at a higher wage than the other. And again, this may be part of the story relating inequality and trade. Now, another very fundamental point, and personally I believe that it is a point of utmost importance to explain what is going on, is that what we have observed, I mean, globalization is more trade, of course, but more trade and more fragmentation of the value chain. Now, an international company is thinking about what is the optimal allocation, geographical allocation of its production, And then we have that part of the production being done in one country, another part in another country. You have a different example of this type. You have the famous example of the iPhone, which is produced in, I don't remember how many countries, mostly in China. All the hardware is produced in several countries in China. And because of that, the reason why those companies do that, they do that simply because they want to maximize their profit. And somehow the possibility opened by technology, the fact that you can move goods and people and information, data much more easily, they are using that new technology in order to improve their profit, and this probably benefits capital owners and managers. So this will explain why the top is changing a lot. Now, there is, in the old days and still today, there is also a big debate about what is the role of technical progress. One very simple view about increasing inequality in the world would be to say we are using technological processes which are more and more intensive in skilled labor because they are more and more sophisticated. So technical progress is demanding more skilled workers, and the wage of skilled workers, and maybe highly skilled workers, is increasing more than the wage of the unskilled workers. Maybe. And then some people say, but this has nothing to do with globalization. This is simply the ICT revolution. But then there is an ambiguity there. I mean, is really technical progress something which is completely exogenous, coming from heaven? Is it the case that suddenly somebody wakes up in the morning with a fantastic idea, and then later on this becomes a new industrial process? Or is it the case that because of competition, because of globalization, because competition now is global, then companies have much stronger incentive to innovate and to invest in R&D, and therefore to produce technical progress. If this is the case, then it is difficult to make a distinction between technical progress as such and globalization as such. We cannot reject the hypothesis that part of the technical progress, not only in terms of intensity, but the structure of technical progress is due to the globalization process itself. In all these areas, you have people working on this, trying to figure out what the relationship between inequality and those drivers should be, trying to look at the theory, trying to get some empirical evidence on it. This is what I was calling the technical aspect of all these a little earlier, and I don't want to get into that, but you have to realize that these are not cheap considerations. Oh, why don't we imagine this and why don't we imagine that? Many people are really working on this, and many of them believe that they found some empirical evidence for that. One very common critique of all this is to say, if your story is a story of unskilled labor at the beginning, then there is something which is not completely consistent. If in developed countries unskilled labor would be hurt by opening trade, then in developing countries unskilled labor should benefit from that. And this is an interesting question, because we observe that in particular in the countries which are the most responsible for this competition between the North and the South, that we have an increase in inequality, and the unskilled workers are not benefiting that much from this opening trade and from the development process. And one possible explanation to that is the fact that you have a labor market in those countries which works in a very different way. In development, you have this well-known assumption or hypothesis, the Lewis hypothesis, of development with an unlimited supply of labor. You go to China, you look at what is the reserve of labor still in the countryside, And you find that there are still many, at least until recently, there were still many people willing to migrate to the cities. You know that in China the migration process is rather strictly controlled, so not everybody is moving because they find that the salaries are higher in the cities. But this existence of reserve army is sufficient to say that wages in the cities are set probably on some kind of arbitrary basis. And if the employment, if activity increases, there is no reason to increase the salary of those people. So we can prove very easily that in that case, the gainers in the process will also be the capital owners and the skilled workers. So it's not really, we cannot say that there is something contradictory. I think that there is a very simple explanation to that. Now, there are many other factors which play a role in increasing inequality and which are not necessarily connected to globalization. One is this generalized increase in competition in general in many countries and deregulation. This really started with the neoliberal revolution, with Reagan and the supply side economics in the early 80s, and with, of course, Margaret Thatcher in the UK. But it's certainly the case that we had all this wave of privatization, which definitely had an impact on the distribution of income in all countries. It may not be the distribution of wages, the distribution of earnings, it may also be the distribution of standard of living, purchasing power, because the price of privatized services might have gone up. So we know, and many people have worked on this, that this has an impact on the distribution. This is French.
Yes.
Okay, we're globalized. Sorry for this French word. So the deregulation of, in particular, the financial sector, deregulation in many countries of the labor market, had also an impact on the inequality. And in both cases, you might say that this is somewhat related to globalization in the sense, always the same argument. More competition with the rest of the world, then we need to be much more efficient within our borders, and we want to get rid of all the barriers which may generate some inefficiency. Forget about Asia, forget about the US, look at Europe. What is the impact of the single market in Europe? Immediately you had much more competition in many sectors, in particular the manufacturing sectors. And in order to respond to that increased competition in many countries, people started to deregulate, whereas there were not, there was no ideological bias going toward regulation. There is a big difference between Mr. Mitterrand in France in the 80s deregulating and Mrs. Thatcher deregulating. But at some stage, you had to follow, countries had to follow the example. There was some contagion, and my view that the links between all those countries had a role to play in these. The big thing, certainly, is, we could call that deregulation, but it is really the drop in the progressivity of the tax system. Total tax receipts didn't change that much, but the progressivity changed enormously. In the UK, in 20 years, maybe a little more, 23, I don't remember exactly the number of years, the top rate of taxation went down from 73% to 40%, and now only lately, 2 years ago, it was put up to 45%. They proposed 50%, and then it didn't go through Parliament, and now they are to 45%. The difference is really absolutely enormous. Sweden, 1992, the crisis in Sweden, what the Swedes realized is that they need to have a much more flexible economy. They had a top tax rate which was 85%, the top tax rate is brought down from 85 to 60, 65. So, in all countries, practically all developed countries, had seen this drop in the progressivity of the taxation. And this was encouraged, of course, by the mobility of capital, in particular in Europe, where you could not tax the capital income in a very, very different way in two different countries in order to avoid the migration of capital. And final, now, is that due again to globalization or not? I would use the same kind of argument of competition to explain that. The argument which was put forward to reduce the progressivity of the tax system was simply to say, how do you want us to compete with our neighbors? They have a tax rate on their maximum tax rate which is 40%. We have a tax rate which is 60%. We cannot compete. Whether this argument is correct or not, maybe I leave it to you. Personally, I don't think that this argument is correct. But at least this was the argument that was used. And because of that, we could say that globalization has a role to play there. And finally, you have the financialization and the fact that you had the internationalization of the shareholders in many companies. The fact that pension funds from another country were becoming shareholders of a national company, were requiring rates of return which were much higher than what was required before, or were requiring short-run rates of return higher than before, maybe at the expense of the long-run rates of return. This is something which is linked to the evolution of the financial system, and which is linked to the fact that very quickly this financial system became completely global. I think I'm at the end of my time, but let me take 5-10 minutes to finish. Yeah? Okay. First thing is, we have observed that globalization will most likely has played a big role in that evolution of inequality in the world. One positive aspect is less difference between rich and poor countries, the catching up by emerging countries, and the negative aspect, which is increase in the inequality within countries. Now, there is a risk that if the growth of inequality keeps increasing in many countries, and among them big countries, major players in the global economy, that this may become an impediment toward more progress toward a global economy. We might very well at some stage find a big protectionist pressure in some countries, which will say inequality now is absolutely unbearable. This is due to the liberalization of trade. We want to reintroduce some barriers in order to avoid that. From that point of view, inequality increasing or inequality being too high is a possible impediment to get or to benefit from the gains from globalization. It is also possible that an increase in inequality will generate social, political tensions, which will make governing a country more and more difficult, and which will generate a cost because of those tensions, even when you don't have open conflict. So, one way of looking at justifying policies which will be aimed at reducing inequality is to say, we are philosophers, we are moral philosophers, we believe that social justice is important, and we believe that a world and a country with less inequality is a good thing. And we could justify policies only on that basis. As economists, I say that we can say, no, there is more than that. It is the case that inequality has an economic cost. And for the last 20 years, more or less, economists have worked very, very much precisely on the economic cost that inequality can generate. The fact that somebody has access to some credit, somebody else doesn't have access to credit, the first one is able to is not able to undertake an investment project which is very profitable. The second one can undertake an investment project which is mediocre. We see here very clearly that there is some inefficiency and that inequality may be responsible for that. So there is a big argument, and I think that this view, that inequality is bad for economic efficiency, at least some aspects of inequality are bad for economic efficiency and for economic development, is an idea which is gaining very much ground. So based on that, my own view is that we need to do something in order to keep the positive evolution of the global distribution and to try to prevent national inequalities to go up. And of course, the policies that we can think of are of two types. We want to have policies at an international level which will make sure that no country will lag behind too much. I told about Africa a little earlier. Let's say that Africa, that the commodity prices go down because there is a slowdown in global growth, then those countries will not be able to grow as fast as they have done over the last 10 years. What will happen to them? They will probably lag behind the emerging countries, so more inequality will develop in that part of the distribution. Maybe they will be at the par with developed countries, but this is certainly something that we want to avoid. So I would say that because we have observed this acceleration of growth in those poor countries over the recent past, that the whole development agenda is becoming irrelevant. The development agenda is still relevant, and we must make sure that we take all the measures that will prevent countries to fall behind. And again, this is not something which is right. This was the idea that I wanted to express here, but I will go to the second part, which is what can we do to control national inequality? The first thing we have to realize is that what I have described about the increase in national inequalities and possible forces behind that linked to globalization. Even though we may be in a crisis, that we have this slowdown of the global economy and certainly a slowdown of economies of developed countries. The process or the forces behind this increase in inequality will not stop. They are still there. The idea that companies will try to find or to optimize their geographical allocation of tasks to produce some specific good. It is because, to some extent, there is less profit to be made in standard markets that they will be looking for progress from that point of view. So the technical aspect, the innovation which we have seen could generate more inequality, this will continue. We could say, oh yes, but there is much less demand for the goods coming from Asia because there is a crisis. This is not completely true. Because there is a crisis in Europe, we might say that people will modify the quality of the goods that they are consuming. And if you want to find goods of lesser quality in some areas, the obvious candidates will be the goods produced in Asia. So we might even imagine that despite the fact that there is a slowdown in developed economies, the market share of emerging countries might keep increasing. So I don't think that we could say for the moment we are out of the woods because with the slowdown nothing will happen and all those forces will disappear. We cannot reject the hypothesis that those forces are still with us, that we may be not at the end of this increase in inequality. And this is a big problem, because are we facing a new high level of inequality that we want to reduce, or are we facing a process of increasing inequality which will not stop tomorrow and which we might not know exactly how to stop. So what are the policies available? Standard question, is protectionism a solution? Then my answer to that is that I believe that protectionism is something important for poor countries, and we are making big mistakes in some international circles by pushing toward the liberalizing trade from these countries. But I don't think this is the case in the emerging countries. So in those countries, protection should go down. We must make sure that indeed there is no increased protection by developed countries. If those countries are tempted by that, it is not clear that the people they are trying to help would actually be better off. Why? Simply because on the one hand there might be more jobs for them, because some goods will be produced at home rather than being imported, or rather being outsourced in Asia or elsewhere. But at the same time, the goods that they are buying, the price will go up. And because the same argument about quality, the goods which are imported are more consumed by the lower part of the income distribution, when you look at the balance of those two effects, the balance is probably negative. So the idea that protectionism would solve the problem of the distribution at the bottom is not completely clear, and at the same time, it is not possible, it is not that part of the distribution that we're interested in. Let me pass on that. Okay, policies. If we believe that the deregulation of the financial sector, in some cases the deregulation of some aspects of the labor market, have played a role in pushing inequality up, and if we believe that the same reforms have not contributed to more efficiency in the economy, then we have clear candidates for reform. Think about this very strongly debated reform of the financial sector, consisting of isolating investment banks from commercial banks. This is going against the deregulation that took place several years ago, and we know that this may produce more efficiency in the system by reducing the probability of a big crisis, and this may also be reducing the inequality impact of the development of the financial sector. So we have to think about some regulation or some deregulation measures which have been taken in the past, which proved to be inefficient, and at the same time which proved to be inegalitarian. And then I would like to conclude with the key role of redistribution policies. I said tax policies have become less and less progressive. Why don't we try to make them more progressive? And this is, quite interestingly, something which is going on lately. I will not advertise a 75% French tax rate, but I observe that in the UK there has been an increase in the tax rate. The recent measure by the Obama administration is to increase the tax rate, and it is sufficient to have a few countries, and certainly to have a few big countries doing that, for other countries to consider that this is not completely ridiculous, or for some constituencies to be able to use that as an example, and to say, look, they have done that, no drama, people will not immediately move to another country because we have increased the tax rate, and there may be something, some contagion, some positive contagion taking place. So I think this is really something that has to be considered. Of course, the French government has gone much too far, but there must be some reasonable limit between nothing and between this kind of things. In developing countries, I think it is also to be emphasized the fact that those countries, for the moment, have a very low taxing capacity. And because of that, they are not able really to modify the distribution with very much ease. We now have all those conditional cash transfer programs which are feeding the bottom of the distribution, but at the top of the distribution, the taxation is very little progressive. And this is somewhat surprising because at the same time, the technology is such that we have all the ways to control the income of the expenditure of people. Who is not using a credit card? And as soon as you are using a credit card, it's very, very easy to look at the expenditure that you have made during a month or during a year, and then to tell people you'll be taxed in a progressive way on that basis. So the instruments to create a real progressive tax system do exist, and if those countries want to be able to influence the distribution, this is something that they should get in. But most importantly, I believe, is really the idea of, in all those countries, this is not a reaction to globalization. This is something which is in parallel, which is the fact that we observe that in many countries opportunities are unequal. We observe that kids when they are 15 years old and they pass this PISA test, get very different results. There is a lot of stratification, social stratification in the result of the educational system, meaning that opportunities are not really equalized in our countries, and meaning that we are missing some talent, we are missing some opportunities to improve the efficiency of our economies. Same thing with the wealth that people inherit from their parents. Same thing with the kind of discrimination, whether it is gender discrimination, whether it is ethnic discrimination, which is certainly something which is completely inefficient and at the same time which is very inegalitarian. So looking at inequalities which are upstream to some extent in comparison with income inequality, there is very, very much to be done. This is not in reaction to globalization, but if we are convinced that progress can be made in terms of efficiency, in terms of equality in that direction, this is a way of offsetting, compensating, at least for a while, the increasing inequality which may be linked to globalization. So let me conclude here. Few bullet points. Globalization is a positive sum game with potentially adverse distributional effects at national level. This is what we observe in many countries. Growing national inequalities may have a huge economic cost at both the national and the global level, but there is no reason to be passive, which I believe we are. We have been over the last 15 or 20 years. We can try to correct market failures through regulation when this is efficiency enhancing, and often this is egalitarian. The more equal distribution of opportunities is efficiency enhancing. And these are the reasons why this is the case. So let me, because I'm really now very, very late, let me finish with only one chart, which I love, which is the example of Brazil. Brazil was, I told you that at the beginning, one of the most egalitarian countries in the world. Here you have the Gini coefficient in Brazil since the mid-70s. And you see that it's more or less flat. For a long time you have this big pipe, which is essentially the hyperinflation crisis in Brazil just at the end of the 80s. And we know that hyperinflation crises have a huge impact on inequality. But except for that, you have something which is more or less flat. At a very high level, the Gini coefficient, which is 0.60. And then at the end of the 90s, early 2000, you have this trend, downward trend which starts, and which is very, very, very substantial. In 10 years, the Gini coefficient in Brazil has lost 6 percentage points. 15 years ago, anybody would have said in Brazil, it is possible to do that. The Brazilians would never have believed this person. Now, what is behind that? Many, many things. There is a conditional cash transfer program transferring money to the poor. But it is not the only thing. You have a change in the fertility behavior of the families. Poor families with much less children. This has an impact on poverty, this has an impact on the distribution. You have the impact of education, and the fact that you have more and more people who have gone through lower and higher secondary school, who are now in the labour market. This also is playing a big role. These are not policies which can be decided from a day to the next and will have an impact the day after the next. These are policies which are long-run policies, but at the end, which are able to produce results. Now, I will not say that this is the end of the road for Brazil. The Gini coefficient is still 0.54 today, which is absolutely enormous, but at least this shows that it is possible to act to influence the distribution, to make it less unequal, and we are all Brazilians. Thank you very much.